Welcome to the deep dive, everyone, where we kind of like go deep into some really interesting stuff. And today we're taking a look at Islamic inheritance law. We're going to be cracking open Sunan Abu Dawud, specifically Book 12, which is all about inheritance shares.
Mm.
Now, when you hear inheritance, you might think, okay, dividing up possessions, right? But I think you'll find as we go through this that it's way more than that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think about it as just that, somebody passes away and then their stuff gets divided. But it's really a reflection of a lot of things, like the values of that society and family ties, even historical events. Like you can learn a lot about the changes that went on within the Muslim community based on how they dealt with inheritance.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so exciting. We're not just looking at a dry set of rules.
Mhm.
We're trying to understand the heart of Islamic law.
Absolutely. It's like a window into the principles, right? Like what did the early Muslims consider fair and just, and how did they put those principles into practice?
Exactly. So today our mission is to unlock these secrets, right? To see what these specific hadiths can teach us about the nuances of Islamic inheritance law. I guess like any good investigation, we got to start with the basics.
Yeah, the foundation, right? And Hadith 2879 kind of lays it out for us. Like, first and foremost, knowledge. Knowledge is key in Islam, and there are like three main sources that Muslims rely on. First, of course, you've got the Quran, it's the word of God, the ultimate guide. Then there's the Sunnah.
Yeah, the Sunnah, I think a lot of people who aren't as familiar might not know exactly what that refers to.
Yeah, for sure. So the Sunnah basically refers to the teachings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So it's like how he lived his life, what he said, what he did. It's a model for Muslims to follow.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Hmm.
So the Quran and the Sunnah, and is that it?
Well, those are the two primary sources. But then you have the obligations that have been established over time,
Right.
by Islamic scholars, building upon those first two sources. So it's like a chain of knowledge, right?
Mm.
Passed down through generations.
Okay, so that sets the stage for understanding why these hadiths are so important. They're part of that tradition.
Yeah, exactly. They show us how the early Muslims grappled with real life situations and, how they sought guidance from the Prophet.
We're like real people dealing with real problems,
Yeah.
right? I mean, isn't that like the whole point of Islamic law? To provide guidance for how to live a good and just life.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just like some theoretical exercise. These were real people with real concerns.
Right. And like speaking of real concerns, right?
Yeah.
Hadiths 2880 and 2881 tell this really interesting story about Jabir, one of the Prophet's companions.
Hmm.
So Jabir's like seriously ill, right?
Yeah.
And he's worried about what's going to happen to his sisters if he dies.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one. It's really powerful because it shows how Islamic law developed in response to real needs.
Right. Like his sisters don't have any sons or fathers who would typically inherit.
Right.
Right. So their future's kind of uncertain. And Jabir's like lying there sick, worrying about him. And you know what? This worry, his concern for his sisters, actually leads to a divine revelation.
Wow, that's amazing. So it wasn't just scholars debating in some ivory tower. It was like this direct connection between a real life problem and divine guidance.
Exactly. And through this revelation, God clarifies the inheritance shares for sisters, specifically in cases where there are no direct male descendants or ascendants, fathers or sons.
So you can see how responsive Islamic legal development was to the needs of the community. Like it wasn't just a set of rules handed down, but it was this living system, right? Adapting to real challenges.
It shows like the human side of it, right? That it was about caring for people and making sure that everyone was treated fairly.
Absolutely. And that's crucial for understanding Islamic law as a whole. It's not meant to be this rigid, inflexible thing. It's meant to be a source of guidance and, to ensure justice in this constantly changing world.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's about being just and fair, right? Not just blindly following rules.
Exactly. Like, think about it. Life is messy, things happen, and Islamic law has to be able to adapt to those changes.
Right. And speaking of adapting, there's this term that pops up a lot in these discussions, kalala. It sounds kind of intimidating, but I think Hadith 2883 helps break it down.
Oh, yeah, kalala. It basically refers to individuals who die without leaving any descendants or ascendants.
So no children, no grandchildren, no parents, no grandparents.
Exactly. Like they don't have those closest family members who would typically inherit.
And I guess that creates a whole new set of challenges, right? Like who gets their inheritance then?
Right. So Islamic law addresses these cases very carefully. Like they want to make sure that the wealth is distributed fairly, even when the situation's a little more complicated.
So it's about being thorough and meticulous, right? Leaving no room for ambiguity or disputes.
Yeah, exactly. They want to make sure that everything's covered, every possible scenario. And you see this meticulousness throughout Islamic inheritance law. Like, it's a recurring theme.
But even with the best intentions, right? Like, disagreements happen. I mean, we're talking about humans interpreting complex principles, and Hadith 2884 gives us a peek into one of those situations.
Yeah, this one's really interesting because it shows that even among the most knowledgeable individuals, there could be like varying opinions, right? Like in this case, some of the Prophet's companions initially disagreed on the inheritance shares for a daughter, a son's daughter, and a sister.
Oh, wow. So even they didn't always agree. I guess that makes sense, though, right? It's complex stuff.
Yeah, and it wasn't like they got into a big fight or anything. It was more like a healthy debate. Like they were trying to figure out the most just and accurate interpretation.
So how do they resolve it?
Well, Ibn Masud, who was known for his wisdom, he stepped in. And he referred back to a judgment that the Prophet Muhammad himself had made in a similar situation. So it shows the importance of precedent in Islamic law and the ultimate authority of the Prophet's decisions.
It's like saying, okay, we might have different opinions. Let's see what the Prophet did, because, like, that carries the most weight.
Exactly. Like it's a way to find clarity and unity even when there are disagreements. Like the Prophet is the ultimate guide, right? So his decisions are what matter most.
That makes sense. And it shows how the system was designed to work, right? To have this ultimate source of authority that could resolve disputes.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a built-in mechanism for finding consensus.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Islamic inheritance law is all about being just, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Hadith 2885 really brings that point home. It tells the story of a woman who goes to the Prophet seeking justice for her orphaned granddaughters.
Oh, yeah, this one always gets me. It's so powerful because it shows that it's not just about cold calculations, right? It's about protecting the vulnerable, like especially orphans who are often taken advantage of.
Yeah, totally. And you know what's crazy? Her own brother-in-law, the girl's paternal uncle, was trying to withhold their inheritance from them. Can you imagine?
I know, it's like he was trying to exploit them, but the Prophet, he immediately stepped in and made sure that the girls received their rightful inheritance.
What's amazing is that, like, the Quran itself addresses this situation directly. Verses were revealed to make it absolutely clear that orphans have rights.
And nobody, not even family, can take those rights away. It's like enshrined in the law.
It speaks volumes about the values that Islam upholds, right?
Yeah.
Fairness, compassion, and standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves.
Absolutely. And it shows that Islamic law is not just about abstract principles, but it's about real people and real lives.
I'm telling you, this deep dive is already blowing my mind. It's so much more than just legal technicalities. It's about real people, real struggles, and a system that's striving to create a just and equitable society.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Like there's so much more to uncover here, layer upon layer of wisdom and insight.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep digging. What other treasures await us in the world of Islamic inheritance law?
Well, we've talked about, what happens when someone dies without direct descendants, right? But what about grandparents? Where do they fit into all this? And then there's this whole category of relatives called agnates. And, well, you'll just have to stay tuned to find out.
So we've seen how Islamic inheritance law, handles these really specific situations. Like, what happens when someone dies without direct descendants? Or, how orphans are protected. But what about grandparents? Like, where do they fit into all of this?
That's a great question, and it's actually addressed in Hadiths 2888 through 28901. They specifically deal with the inheritance shares for grandmothers and grandfathers. And what's really cool is that these Hadiths, they actually show us how the early Islamic scholars, they use like their legal reasoning to figure out these rulings.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't just like handed down to them.
Yeah, not at all. They were really thinking critically about it. Like
Yeah.
they considered the Quran, obviously, the Sunnah, the Prophet's teachings and practices, and they even consulted each other. Like they had these discussions and debates to try and reach a sound conclusion.
So like a legal puzzle, right?
Yeah.
They were using all the pieces of evidence and knowledge they had to try and figure out the most just outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the most interesting stories is about Abu Bakr. He was the first caliph after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Right, right.
So Abu Bakr initially made a ruling about a grandmother's inheritance, but later he actually changed his opinion.
Oh, wow. Why did he do that?
Well, Umar, another prominent companion, he presented a different perspective, and he had some really strong reasoning to back it up. And, Abu Bakr, he was humble enough to say, okay, you know what? You've convinced me. I think this is a better interpretation.
It's cool to see that, like, even someone like Abu Bakr, who was so close to the Prophet, was
Yeah.
still open to, like, learning and changing his mind.
Exactly. It shows that they weren't infallible,
Yeah.
like they were human beings who were constantly striving to learn and to reach the most just and accurate interpretations.
It really humanizes them, right? Makes them seem more relatable.
And I think it's an important reminder for us today, too, that Islamic jurisprudence wasn't about blindly following rules. It was and still is a dynamic process. It encourages critical thinking and intellectual humility.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's about engaging with material, right?
Yeah,
Not
well,
just taking it at face value.
absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about descendants, ascendants, grandparents, but there's another category of relatives that Islamic inheritance law deals with. They're called agnates.
Agnates, okay. I'm not familiar with that term. What does that mean?
Basically, agnates are male relatives who are linked through a male line. So, like your father, your brother, your father's brother, your son's son, those are all agnates.
Okay, so it's a very specific, like, lineage?
Right. And Hadith 280-92 outlines their inheritance rights. And, this is where we see a patriarchal structure within the traditional system. Like in certain situations, male heirs were given priority over female heirs.
That's definitely something that people bring up a lot when they talk about Islamic inheritance law. How do we reconcile that,
Sure.
like this patriarchal aspect with, the emphasis on justice and fairness that we've been talking about?
It's a complex issue, and
Yeah.
it's important to consider the historical context. We're talking about 7th century Arabia, like a society where tribal structures and patriarchal norms were deeply ingrained. And, Islamic inheritance law, it was revolutionary in many ways. But it didn't completely overturn all of the existing social realities.
So it was about making improvements within the context of the time, even if it, didn't completely align with what we might consider like ideal today.
Right, exactly. It's about progress, right?
Yeah.
Not perfection. And that's why it's crucial to study Islamic law with like historical awareness,
Mm.
but also with an understanding of its broader ethical principles.
Okay, that makes sense. So agnates are those male relatives who inherit through the male line. What about like maternal relatives? Where do they fit in?
Yeah, good question. Hadiths 2893 to 2895, those deal with the role of maternal relatives in inheritance. And this is where you see another really beautiful layer of social responsibility woven into the system.
Social responsibility. Okay, how so?
Well, these hadiths highlight this concept of the Prophet Muhammad as a protector of those who don't have any other heirs. So, like, let's say someone passes away, right, and they don't have any children, parents, grandparents, or even any agnates to inherit.
So like no one from their immediate family.
Right. In those cases, their maternal relatives step in. It's um, like a safety net built into the system and make sure that, even those who might be considered distant relatives, they're not completely abandoned.
That's really thoughtful. It's like saying, we're not just about bloodlines and legal definitions. We're about taking care of each other
Hmm.
and recognizing the bonds of kinship, even when they're not, immediately obvious.
And the prophet's role in this is so important. He's not just a lawgiver, right? He's like the embodiment of compassion and mercy. He steps in as a guardian for those who have no one else. It ensures that they're treated with dignity and, their rights are protected.
Wow. So it adds this whole other dimension to the ethical framework of Islamic inheritance law.
Mhm.
It's not just about like legal precision. It's about a community looking after its members, especially the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. And that's a principle that, it resonates deeply no matter what your background is. It's about caring for those in need. It's a universal human value.
Yeah, for sure. Now, one question that often comes up is like, what happens when people of different faiths are involved? Like, can a Muslim inherit from a non-Muslim or vice versa?
That's a fascinating question. And actually, a set of hadiths 2903 to 2908, deal with this very issue. And they're really interesting because they actually might seem contradictory at first.
Oh, really? So there's no easy answer.
Not quite. They reflect different opinions and interpretations that existed among early Muslims. And it highlights the importance of, like, context in understanding Islamic law. It wasn't just a static set of rules. It was this dynamic process of interpretation and adaptation.
So how do we make sense of these hadiths that seem to contradict each other? Does it mean that Islamic law is inconsistent?
No, not at all. It means that we have to, like, delve deeper, look at the nuances of each hadith, and consider the historical circumstances. Some scholars argue that certain hadiths dealing with inheritance across faiths were specific to, like, the early Medinan context, when Muslims were establishing relationships with people of other religions.
Oh, so as the Muslim community grew and, the situation changed, those rulings might have been, reinterpreted or superseded by other principles.
Exactly. It's like this legal puzzle, right? We have all these different pieces of evidence, and we have to put them together in a way that makes sense, considering the overall goals and values of Islamic law.
Sounds complicated.
It can be, and that's why the role of qualified scholars is so crucial, right? They have the knowledge and the expertise to navigate these complexities.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Descendants, ascendants, grandparents, agnates, maternal relatives, inheritance across faiths. It's a lot. But there's one more group I want to ask about. Freed slaves.
Mhm.
How did Islamic law address, their rights in relation to inheritance?
That's a really important aspect to understand because it shows how Islamic law dealt with social dynamics and, the evolving status of formerly enslaved individuals. Hadiths 2909 to 2911, those offer some insights. What's really remarkable is that Islamic law, it didn't just grant personal freedom to those who were emancipated, but it also sought to ensure that they had, legal and economic rights, including the right to inherit.
So it wasn't just about freeing them physically, but also about, integrating them into society as full-fledged members.
Exactly. They had rights, they had protections, and this was like a radical departure from the norms of that time. In many societies, freed slaves were still seen as second-class citizens, but Islamic law, it emphasized their humanity, their entitlement to justice and fairness.
Yeah, that's really progressive for the time. What's interesting, though, is that these hadiths also talk about this concept of patronage, where the person who freed a slave, they still retain certain inheritance rights. How does that fit in with the idea of freeing slaves and giving them full rights?
Well, you can think of it as a kind of transitional phase, right? The concept of patronage, it reflects the effort to, bridge the gap between the old system of slavery and this new order based on individual freedom and equality. It acknowledged existing social bonds and obligations, but, gradually moved towards a more equitable system.
So like a step-by-step process. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's another example of how Islamic law, it wasn't about imposing this rigid set of rules. It was about adapting to the realities of the time while still striving for those ideals of justice and compassion.
This has been a really insightful journey so far. I'm amazed by the depth and nuance of Islamic inheritance law. It's so much more than just dividing stuff up.
It really is. It's a reflection of a society's values, its understanding of justice, and its commitment to caring for all its members.
And we still have more to explore. There are a few more fascinating cases and principles in these hadiths that I think can shed even more light on this intricate and thought-provoking aspect of Islamic law. It's amazing to me, as we've been going through these hadiths about Islamic inheritance law, just how many different situations they cover. It's like they really thought of everything, all these different scenarios that could come up, and, they provided guidance on how to handle them fairly.
Yeah. It speaks to the comprehensiveness of Islamic law. It's not just about one aspect of life, right? It's about the whole thing. Spiritual, ritual, social, economic, legal. It all ties together.
Yeah, and inheritance, we've seen, it plays a huge role in all of that, right? Keeping society stable, protecting the vulnerable,
Right.
making sure wealth is distributed justly.
Absolutely. It's about creating a framework for a just and equitable society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one case that I think really shows this is the story of the lion child. It's in Hadiths 2900 to 2902. And it deals with, a really tough situation where the legitimacy of a child is questioned.
It's a very sensitive issue, for sure. And what's interesting is how Islamic law provides a way to resolve these kinds of disputes while still upholding the principles of justice and, protecting people from false accusations.
Right, because that's a serious thing.
Absolutely. And the lion provision basically allows both the husband and the wife to take oaths, invoking God's judgment. And there are serious consequences if they lie.
So it's like a last resort kind of thing when there's no clear evidence, but, these big accusations are being made.
Exactly. And it really shows how seriously Islam takes false accusations. The consequences are there to deter people from abusing this provision.
Right. It's not something to be taken lightly.
Not at all. And it also shows the importance of due process, right? Even in these really personal and emotional matters, there's a system in place to make sure that justice is done, but also that the rights and reputations of everyone involved are protected.
It's about finding that balance. Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to something we talked about before. Inheritance across faiths. Remember those hadiths about Muslims inheriting from non-Muslims and vice versa?
Yeah, the ones that seem to contradict each other.
Right. It really got me thinking about how Islamic legal understanding has evolved over time.
It's a great example of how, even though Islamic law is based on the Quran and the Sunnah, it's not like stuck in time. It's this dynamic
It's
process.
always being reinterpreted and adapted.
Exactly. And the fact that there were different opinions, even among the Prophet's companions, it just shows that it wasn't about like blindly following rules. It was about this deep thinking and, really trying to find the most just solution.
And that's something we can learn from today, I think. To be open to different perspectives and to keep learning and growing in our understanding.
Absolutely. The pursuit of justice and truth, it's an ongoing process.
Well, I've got to say, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into Islamic inheritance law. It's way more than just dividing up possessions after someone passes away. It's really about, the values of society and its commitment to justice and caring for its members.
I couldn't agree more. It's really thought-provoking and relevant, even today.
And it's something we can all learn from, no matter what our background is. The principles of fairness and social responsibility and compassion, those are universal.
Beautifully said. It's a reminder that we can find wisdom and guidance in the most unexpected places. And that, by engaging with different perspectives, we can all grow in our understanding of justice and ethics and just like what it means to be human.
Well said. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Islamic inheritance law. We hope you found it as insightful as we did. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking knowledge.